and also their fellow Yay community members. So to start things off, we have Kathy Koo, who is the co-founder of Spouts of Water, the makers of a ceramic water filter. So she's graced us with her presence here today amongst her busy schedule. So thank you so much for being with us, Kathy.
Yeah, anytime. It's my pleasure to be here today.
Cool, cool. So just to get things started, we're going to kind of jump in, have Kathy give us a quick overview of her business, and then I'll present some questions. And then if there's any other questions that you guys on Facebook have for Kathy, you can post them in the comments section, and we can hopefully get to those at the end of the segment. So to that end, let's start things off with discussing ideation when it comes to a social enterprise. So how did you decide to create a ceramic water filter? How did you decide on the market? And what was the business model that you decided to use when going into running a nonprofit venture or social venture?
Yeah. So I think for starters, Spouts really came out of this this strong recognition that there's a need for a clean water product. And when I first traveled to Uganda in 2010 for teaching at an all-girls academy, unrelated to clean water, but more related to health and hygiene, I realized that there weren't any solutions that were available that were really affordable and sustainable. And so I went back and worked on a design project for probably more than a year, just back in the States, actually 2 years, and looked at different solutions and came upon ceramic water filters as being a really good fit for the area, particularly because clay was abundant. People were used to storing water in clay jugs, so they really liked the flavor of the water that would come through.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So we came across, this product much later than the original need identification. And so it actually ended up being a lot easier in that sense because we kind of knew that this was a good fit for the market even before we had thought of doing this, because we kind of went backward in the process.
Okay, very interesting. Interesting that they preferred the taste of the clay water filter. So that's also something quite niche, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I personally had to learn to get used to it. But for people who were using our filters in the community, they're like, oh yeah, we store water in clay jugs all the time. We really like that this cools down the water and leaves behind this like terracotta taste essentially.
And of course, you're not from Uganda, and as you mentioned, you were there with a girls' school. So, was it something that you said when you went there that you really wanted to work there, or was it just that you saw this kind of opening in the market for something where you could really see yourself adding value? How did you decide to work in Uganda?
Yeah, I think it was definitely the latter. We saw that I had no business background, no intention of really starting a business of my own, but went in and saw this need. And so when I was working on kind of coming up with an idea that would be a good fit for the community, I actually initially approached a bunch of organizations on the ground with ceramic water filters and said, hey, I think this product would work really well. I can help, apply to grants or bring in funding or help through the design process. But I would really like to bring this product to market. And everyone shot me down. So they're like, oh, we're really more in the distributions side of things, definitely not on the manufacturing side, which is understandable because I think it is a little bit kind of strange for a lot of nonprofits to go into the manufacturing side. And so then we went, once kind of everyone shot me down, they did say, however, that they were really impressed with the product and would be totally willing to purchase the products if they were available. So then myself and my co-founder and a group of us kind of switched gears to kind of think about how we could start manufacturing filters then.
Okay. Wow. So really interesting story. Not what you expected to be doing with your life then, I suppose.
Absolutely not.
Okay, well, that's also interesting for maybe some people who are watching who are thinking, that they're struggling with the ideation and that, they're not sure what they want to do. And maybe even they have some other passions, but something can kind of spark you and then it takes you down a completely different path than you intended to go down.
Exactly.
Very cool. All right, so let's move on to the next question, which we had discussed, which is, what is the ideation process like for, social ventures? Are you able to kind of put a lot of money behind, product testing and, reiterations of, let's say, the filter in this case? How many, if you went through quite a few, did you go for before you went to market? And was this something that was quite extensive and took up a lot of, let's say, people power to put into?
Yeah. Our product testing outside of Uganda, just purely from an academic standpoint, took 2 years. And I think I had the unique advantage of being a student. So being a student meant that I had access to all that academia had to offer. I had professors, access to lab space, and so we really had no funding at that point during that phase. I was an engineering student, so I just used the school's resources.
Nice.
And people were pretty willing to help. We had a couple of engineers from actual firms from around the area, and I would email them, be like, hey, I was kind of looking at this product. I'm not sure how this works. Do you have any insight onto it? We got help from like the brick making industry, because why not? They're firing ceramics. Exactly. They're really helpful. I think everyone is really willing to help, especially when you are approaching them with a social product. And so, as extensive as our product testing phase was, we had so much help from the get-go. So that was really valuable. In terms of once we got to Uganda, we had this idea in 2010 of, we kind of understand how the production process works. But once we got to Uganda, we realized that kind of making a social product means that not only does the end product need to do good, but it also applies to the entire production process. So we kind of changed some of the materials that would go into it to be a little bit more locally sourced. So the materials slightly changed. And so it took another 2 years for us to get a final product that we could actually sell in country.
So 4 years in total from the initial idea to going to market. Wow, that's a lot. And I think that's interesting also to note that once you got there, you kind of had to rethink everything all over again. Like what you thought maybe was going to work in the testing environment didn't necessarily work in, let's say, the real world environment. That's really interesting. And also I think it's nice to note, because I know with a lot of nonprofits, obviously the end product with the social venture that you see is something that is, made with a purpose or made to be sustainable, but maybe some parts along the supply chain are not so, let's say, sustainable or environmentally friendly. So that's also really interesting that you took that entire process into consideration. Was that something that made everything a little bit more difficult, or was that something you were like, no, this is what we need to do to like stay true to our vision?
Yeah, I think because we had exactly that vision that like we needed to kind of make everything sustainable. It was kind of built into the process from the get-go. I think part of the thing was that I'd worked with a ton of NGOs and kind of seen different products out there already. And I thought that one of the differentiating factors is that we can make a product that is not only providing a service at the end, but also kind of providing jobs and throughout the entire production process.
Okay, so providing jobs was also like a big thing that you guys took into consideration. And I guess these jobs would have all been going to local artisans or producers or suppliers, whatever it was. So that's also really, really cool element to your story that maybe people don't necessarily see on the final end.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we'll continue on. No questions just yet. So as a social venture, I'm sure you came across many struggles or hurdles along the way. Were there any in particular that stuck out that maybe they're not too much of a sore spot that you feel you can talk about now? And do you believe any of these are very specific to social ventures? Obviously, I can imagine the funding is the first thing that comes to mind, as you've already addressed it. But are there any, others, and maybe some that you also found really valuable as a learning experience as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like you said, funding is always our number one kind of initial difficulty, especially because we're not, looking at investors, we're looking at grants really. I think now kind of the social, like the impact funding space has gotten a little bit bigger, but it's really nothing compared to, it's a drop in the bucket compared to like traditional investments. And so we were bootstrapping for a really long time. But that's probably, I mean, I'm sure people who are running just, enterprises in general are struggling with that as well. I think one thing that kind of was strange as a social enterprise in Uganda, where a lot of our, other people were running just businesses, was that people would sometimes ask, like, why are you doing this? Why would you choose to make filters and sell this product when you could totally be doing something more lucrative? And I think the idea was that, Uganda is a total green market, right? You can be making anything you want to be making and probably making, a decent amount of money since everything was being imported anyways. And so the argument is, if you're going to spend all this time and kind of resources building a product, like, why would you do this one? And especially because no one knew what filters were. Like, when we were taking filters around, be like, oh, what do you think of this? And they'll be like, what do you mean? Like, you put water in and like water comes out? Because the filter itself looks pretty solid. And like explain to people this idea that, you can use this to make your dirty water cleaner was a huge hurdle for us. And people who saw us go through this struggles, like our closest friends who felt comfortable enough to be like, hey, like, it seems like you're having a lot of problems. Like, you could be making money making toothpicks here. Like, do you really want to be doing this? Was kind of something that we didn't expect initially.
So a problem of changing mindsets as well, like getting people to actually understand the value of the product you made. So like, I guess in business, they often call that like priming or prepping the market, that was a big thing that you guys had to undertake as well.
Absolutely. And it's, for products, if this was like a for-profit, like purely, fun product, then if people aren't receptive to your product, then you're kind of like screwed in a certain way. But for our products, like, we knew that there was an absolute need for it, whether or not people recognize it. So kind of pushing for that initially was pretty challenging.
And again, I'm going to go a little bit off topic, but as for your distribution model, was this also somewhere that you were able to leverage the local community to then, once you would get someone on board as, let's say, a believer in the product and what it could provide to the community, that then that kind of word of mouth through that one local person, you were able to use them as a distributor and also as, let's say, a promoter, and then spread the knowledge of your product that way?
Yeah, I mean, like, people only came to use our product word of mouth, essentially. So it's, no matter how many marketing campaigns we did, as long as their neighbor was using one and their neighbor was like, yeah, this is great, then they would totally buy it. But to purchase a completely foreign product, it was a huge barrier. And so I think at the beginning of this year, we started our own internal program where we sell directly to communities in more rural areas. And so we'll send our sales team out there, kind of work with the local chairman for a couple of weeks and say, hey, this is a product, check it out. And then we would gather all the townspeople and say, hey, like, have you heard about this person using this product? What have they said? What have they said? How much water or how much money are you spending on boiling your water? How many people are getting sick? And walking through that entire process, kind of in a 2-hour, almost seminar style talk, and then kind of offering the filters through a financing plan has worked really well for us.
Okay. And I imagine that kind of marketing, let's say, strategy wasn't something that you guys envisioned using, when kind of envisioning how you would go about distributing the product. I'm sure it was a much, let's say, more tech savvy and using social media and all these things. But in the end, what it comes down to is, if your neighbor sees it and sees them using it, then you can trust it and then you will use it yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, really interesting. I think that goes for a lot of the EA community. They are based in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think there's this kind of larger trend, obviously Silicon Valley is driving this, of course, to, use whatever, newest platform or channel you can. But sometimes it's really going back to the basics. And also, as you guys saw, knowing your market, and if something fancy and high tech is, catching on in Silicon Valley, it may not work at all in the market that you're going into, and you have to be able to maneuver accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, tech only takes us so far.
It definitely does. So beyond that, were there any other, so we talked about obviously how, you had to overcome the mindset and of course the funding. Were there any other, kind of big hurdles that you guys had to overcome, and any others maybe that you felt like really taught you some valuable lessons in entrepreneurship? Are those the two biggest?
Honestly, there are so many challenges along the way that every day felt like we were banging our head against the wall. Particularly because we were entering into a foreign market where, you can't go online, ask for a price list. You can't email all the companies that we were interacting with and be like, hey, look on, Google reviews for the best repair shop in the area. And so we were going for anything that we sourced locally, or any repairs that we were trying to do. We were essentially going door to door in the entire industrial area, and doing kind of like a grid search along the entire, town, and taking it that way. And so that was like a huge challenge, just purely because it was exhausting. But I think we took away, much more from, we would find like a better supply for X when we were originally looking for Y. So it ended up being really valuable to us in the end.
Okay, awesome. And I'm also pretty sure that gave you some kind of credibility with the community, that you are making all these like inroads with local producers. And so that also benefited you in the long run. Like, people were familiar with you, they understood your kind of methods, and they respected that.
Yeah.
Oh, very cool. So following with the struggles, were there any kind of big payoffs that you really saw, and that you feel are unique to working in the social enterprise sphere, that maybe you haven't been in the, let's say, typical for-profit business, but that you can imagine a person working in the for-profit sector wouldn't necessarily experience, or at least not in the same way? And for you personally, maybe you can talk about what some of the payoffs were to creating the Purifia and working at Spouts.
Yeah. Our goal at the end of the line for, in comparison to traditional for-profit businesses, we do have something in common, that we recognize that we wouldn't be sustainable if we weren't profitable. So we do, always strive to be for-profit and be sustainable in the long run. But I think what's different from other kind of traditional businesses is, in addition to kind of measuring our bottom line or our numbers essentially for financial metrics, we measure our impact in a different way as well. So we constantly track the number of diarrheal cases that we averted, the number of lives we might have saved, the time saved for women and children for not having to boil their water, the amount of carbon emissions that we've decreased. And we are constantly sharing these numbers with our teams as well too. And I think this kind of gives us a different view on what it means to be a part of Spouts and to make the Purifia. And I think this is, really something that's valuable to us and brings our whole team together.
I'm curious, those are like insane metrics. How were you able to measure those?
A lot of
with difficulty, I imagine.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on kind of our metrics, partially because some of our funding sources demanded to us, and that we're grateful to them for it actually now, because we have a great kind of tracking system where we can keep track of all of this. Initially, it's felt like a huge financial burden to invest our time and resources to figure all this out. But once you have it in place, it's pretty doable, I think. And the easier part of it is that we are kind of like a 1 to 2 product company. So, once you can kind of figure out your core number of, okay, if X number of people are using our filters, what does that mean in the long run? everything seems to come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, I imagine that information is also extremely valuable to even, let's say, the Ugandan government, for example, and how beneficial it could be for them to, let's say, invest in these kind of filters and make it part of a national scale program. Very interesting stuff. So I kind of skipped ahead earlier, but maybe it would be good for everyone to know, like, when you were going through the ideation process and the re-ideation process and coming up with, the strategy of how you were going to sell the Purifier, how many people were part of your team?
The original kind of in the States side, we probably had like 10 people regularly meeting on a weekly basis to kind of talk through which organizations we'd reached out to, like what new idea we had thought of recently. So it was, I mean, and then by the time we got to Uganda, a lot of them had prior commitments, so not all of them could kind of stick around. But I mean, all of the documentation that they did, all of the contact lists that they had generated, continued to be used while we were in Uganda. So about 10 people-ish, 5 to 10.
Okay, so a small team. And I know your co-founder, John, is also a young entrepreneur himself. What's the story of you and John? How did you guys meet? And how did you both end up working on this project? We're going backwards here a little bit.
Yeah. We actually met through Spouts. We went to the same university, but I was talking about, we had mutual friends, and I was talking to my friends about this recent trip that I took to Uganda and how I felt strongly about exploring this area. And, he reached out to me and said, hey, I heard that you're looking into this. This sounds really cool. I would love to be a part of it. Let's work on this together. And I was like, absolutely.
That's so cool. So it was really just like two driven individuals coming together and really like putting their minds together to make this happen.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's, I think, really important for everyone to hear that, it doesn't have to be, let's say, someone that you've known forever or an investor or someone who's, I don't know, older than you, that it can really, sometimes the most amazing ideas come out of these like random coincidental meetups. I think that also ties into what you said earlier about utilizing all the resources at your disposal. You mentioned using the university, going to the Brick Makers Association. Sometimes people feel like there's not a lot of resources out there, but I think this goes to show when it comes to co-founders and when it comes to people who can support your venture, like just putting the word out there can really benefit you. Yeah.
And, the community, one of the things that I didn't talk about in terms of kind of the benefit of running a social enterprise is the community that you're surrounded by. So even in Uganda, there's a network of social enterprises who kind of meet probably once a quarter, or at least try to meet once a quarter, and talk about the different resources they've been able to access, the troubles that they've been facing, kind of HR strategies, etc. And it's a great community because they're all very smart, business driven, but at the same time, there's this underlying kind of current that they're all there to do good. So it's been a really invaluable experience working with all these social entrepreneurs that you are a part of.
Awesome. So I might put in a little, before we close things up, a little self-promotion, because you were the Yay Global Awards in 2016, and you were flown out to Sweden. So maybe we can talk about how that benefited, or maybe it didn't, the long-term, let's say, mission and vision and network of Spouts.
Yeah. I mean, in the long run, I think it gave us some of the additional publicity and kind of got us out there through that platform. I think there have been a couple of people who've reached out to us, helping either they were interested in our filters, or they were interested in working with us, funding us, or they just had questions about exactly kind of this kind of type of webinar that we've been doing. And it's just made our network of social entrepreneurs, from being within Uganda, which is generally where we've kind of put ourselves in, to becoming a much larger network globally.
Awesome. That's good to hear. So to close things out, everyone is just saying they're really inspired by your story, and it shows, the value of a community, and how you should be leveraging that community at every chance you get. Don't be shy to like reach out and pull on your friends and whoever else you can for support. But you're actually no longer with Spouts. You've passed off the torch. So this was kind of like a chapter in your life that you've closed. What does it mean for you, like looking back on Spouts? How do you see it? What did it add to you as an individual now, and where are you going for the future?
Yeah. I mean, Spouts has so far been, the biggest game changer in my life. It has kind of redefined how I view, the world essentially, and how I approach the world, whether it's from a business standpoint or how I evaluate kind of different businesses around me as well. And so, I don't know, I'm still on the board. I'm still pretty active on a, monthly, maybe weekly basis. And I hope to continue to be involved in Spouts and seeing how it continues to grow and thrive without me being there. And it's been 2 years already since I left on the ground, and they've continued to grow. I think the last time I was in Uganda, we were at 40 employees, and now there's 60 plus employees, kind of getting our filters out there, spreading the word. And we actually have our quarterly report, meeting in a few days. And I'm excited to hear what more, additional changes have happened along the way. As for me, like, I'm still very much committed to social impact. I'm not entirely sure how that'll play out for me, but I'm currently a medical student, and I'm looking forward to seeing how I can kind of tie all these experiences and to create a much larger impact in my communities.
Definitely. So is there any plans of anyone who's, let's say, located in other countries in East Africa seeing Spouts of Water expanding there anytime soon, or still focusing purely on Uganda for the time being?
Yeah, I think in the next couple of years. It's kind of in our discussion at the moment. So we'll keep you posted.
For sure. Okay, great. Well, I think you're really proof positive that, as we say at Yay, if you are supporting youth-led businesses, that youth-led businesses employ other youth, and you're proof of that. I mean, your team is very youthful, and you've worked with the local community, and you employ other youth as well, I'm sure. Not just youth, but the locals in general. So yeah, it's really amazing to hear your story, and of course to catch up with you after the awards in 2016. In the comments, everyone is just saying that this is really inspirational, so we don't actually have any questions. But you are a member of the Yay community, and you do have a profile there. So I am going to say to everyone that they can feel free to reach out to you via the platform and ask you some follow-up questions if they have them about, what it means to be a social entrepreneur and anything else. Hopefully it won't bother you too much while you're at med school if you're getting bombarded with questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
Cool. So you guys heard that. She's open to answering more questions. And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything for now. So we'll say thank you to everyone for tuning in. And thank you so much, Kathy, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with all of us. And we hope to hear more updates from Spouts and yourself in the future.
All right. Thank you. It's great talking to everyone.